welcome to Lecture 7 of Ecology this semester. Today we're going to talk very little bit about bees, so of course I wore one of my many bee-themed dresses for today, but I also wanted to introduce you, oh look, he came out to say hi, to introduce you to some of my friends in this fish tank, because it's actually not a fish tank, there's no fish in it. In this invertebrate marine tank that I have at my house, that's for invertebrate zoology, I'm going to introduce you to some of the animals in here, because we're going to talk about them today. So let's take a closer look. One of my tank friends is actually coming out to say hi right now. This is one of my pet tube worms. Look how beautiful it is. We're going to talk about tube worms today. The other one's hiding. It's in that tube next to it. We're going to talk about tube worms in their U-shaped guts today in animal adaptations. Another animal we're going to talk about today a little bit is we're going to talk about sea urchins. That's one of the very cute sea urchins. I have two in my tank right now. That's one of them is hiding. This is one of the sea urchins for Maggie Hines' research project, but I'm keeping it here until the tanks at school have cycled. So we're going to talk about sea urchins today, too. Another animal that we're going to talk about today are sea anemones that have all these little projections. These right here all over this rock, these are some invasive sea anemones that are in my tank. Here's a really big one that I'm going to zoom in on. Look at all those projections on it. Okay, let's talk a little bit about animal adaptations to the environment. This is going to be the last lecture you'll have before the first exam. Chapter 8 will be up this week, but it won't be on the exam 1. It'll be on exam 2. So, let's talk about them. Autotrophs, which we just talked about in the last lecture, get all their energy from photosynthesis. Heterotrophs, on the other hand, have a whole diversity of strategies for acquiring energy, and we're going to talk about some of those strategies. But there are several processes that are common to all animals. One is acquiring and digesting food. They all need to do that. They have to be able to absorb oxygen. They have to be able to maintain a body temperature and water balance. And they have to be able to adapt to variation in light and temperature, because even in some deep sea marine environments, that will change a little bit, and animals need to be able to deal with that. Aquatic and terrestrial environments are going to pose different constraints on animal adaptation, and we'll talk a little bit about the differences between aquatic and terrestrial adaptations. So one thing that we need to talk about up front is that size is going to impose a fundamental constraint on the evolution of organisms. Let's just talk about some terrestrial examples of huge variations in size and aquatic. This here is a pygmy shrew. It weighs only 2 grams when it's fully grown, and it is a close relative of African elephants, which weigh about 5,000 kilograms. This is a bryozoan. I don't have any of these in my marine invertebrate tank, but bryozoans, well, maybe I do and I just don't know, because they are very small. They can be as small as 0.5 millimeters, and they're about 5 micrograms. In contrast, blue whales, which are also in marine aquatic environments, weigh more than 100,000 kilograms. So you can have huge variations in animal size. Now, how do animals become very small and very large? Animals are cool, but they are bound by the laws of physics, and so there are size constraints depending on the morphology and the structure of the animal. Smaller bodies have a larger surface area relative to their volume than do larger objects of the same shape. That's the surface area to volume ratio. This is really important for understanding with animals, is the surface area to volume ratio. I'll say that again. Smaller bodies have a larger surface area relative to their volume than do large objects of the same shape. So this little wasp here is called a mimerid. It's a tiny, tiny fairy fly. They can sometimes be about the size, it's a wasp, but they're called fairy flies. It can be about the size of an amoeba, and they are so small that they live in aquatic environments, and they basically swim through water like it's air because of how incredibly small they are. This giant beetle larva, on the other hand, has different structural properties. It's terrestrial, and so it has different laws of physics that it needs to deal with. Scaling is another phenomenon in animals, and that's when morphological and physiological features change as a function of body size in a predictable way. So, why don't we ever in the world see giant grasshoppers or giant ants terrorizing the world like we sometimes do in horror movies? A large part of the reason why we don't see giant grasshoppers and giant ants is because of the surface area to volume ratio. Because the larger this animal gets, the more volume it will have relative to its surface area. And the surface area surrounding it in its exoskeleton just won't physically be capable of supporting the volume when they get this large size. Animals with exoskeletons, that is. That's why insects kind of have a limit on how big they can grow. This larva is kind of at the maximum limit for the size at which insects can grow, and that's because the surface area of the exoskeleton can only hold so much volume. But other animals have internal skeletons, and so they can grow a lot bigger. The other problem that large insects would have if we had large insects like these ones in horror movies is that they wouldn't be able to supply all of their tissues with oxygen if they were that large. But a vertebrate has a skeleton that can help support that large volume, and they also have lungs that are able to supply oxygen to the rest of their body. So another thing that we need to think about with the surface area to volume ratio is that the larger you increase in size, the farther the distance to the center of that body, and the longer distance oxygen needs to travel to reach tissues that are in the middle of your body. And so animals have evolved a lot of different strategies for oxygen to be able to be supplied to all of their tissues when they're not in direct contact with the air or the water. One way to increase your surface area to volume ratio is to just be wrinkly. So that's why I showed you my sea anemone earlier, is that sea anemones have all these little projections that increase their surface area to volume ratio. So they've got more surface area to volume, and that allows more direct contact with the water so that they can get oxygen and nutrients directly to their tissues. So you can just be wrinkled and increase your surface area that way. You can also form a tube shape, like the tube worms that I showed you in my aquarium. A tube shape, so having a U-shaped gut and being tube-shaped where all this oxygen and water is now contacting the inside and the outside surface, that's a really great way to increase surface area. Bryozoa also happen to be tube-shaped, and they have these projections. And so basically the entire body surface area is in contact with oxygen, and so it's really easy for them to just use diffusion to get the oxygen that they need to each of their tissues. Tube shapes, being wrinkled, great way to increase surface area to volume. A further elaboration on this tube shape is our lungs and our circulatory system. This is a great way to increase surface area so that we have an increased surface area to volume ratio and more oxygen can be directly supplied to our tissues. Animals have a bunch of different ways of acquiring energy and nutrients. from the environment. You can have herbivores, which eat plants. You can have carnivores, which eat other animals. You can have omnivores, which eat other animals and plants. And then you can have detritivores, which eat decaying material. And there are a diversity of different mouthpart structures that have evolved in animals to deal with eating and obtaining nutrients from these different energy sources. So this here is a mosquito. I got some bites all over my arms from a mosquito during lab last week. They have piercing sucking mouthparts. So they have a kind of like a stylet that then pierces into your skin and allows them to withdraw fluids from your blood. A grasshopper, it's not super well illustrated here, a little bit here, but underneath this labrum here are chewing mouth parts. They're mandibles that let them mash up and chew their food, and then they can sometimes use these palps to help them push the food into their mouth. So these are chewing mouth parts. You can have this strong conical shape beak in birds, and that's this is a cute little cardinal that helps them eat seeds and crack open seeds. Flamingos have real weird mouths. They have this weird straining bill that they use to eat really small insect larvae and small crustaceans in the environment that they live in. Sometimes shrimp, which makes them pink. You can have the tearing beak of a hawk, so it has this little hook here so that it can tear through meat. This is a deer skull. They've got these specially adapted grinding molars that allow them to eat grasses and smaller woody plants. And then here is the skull of a coyote, and you can see their canine shearing teeth that they can use to rip apart meat, and then some of their shearing pointing teeth in the back that also help break up that meat that they eat so that they can acquire energy from that food source. Now let's talk about herbivores. The difficulty with being an herbivore is that you need to convert plant tissue to animal tissue. Animal tissue is high in fat and proteins. The carbon-nitrogen content of animal tissue is about 10 to 1. Plants, on the other hand, are low in protein and high in carbohydrates, like cellulose and lignin, which are really difficult to break down. We'll talk about those specifically in nutrient cycling. But the carbon-nitrogen content in plants is 51. So the real challenge with being an herbivore is how are you going to convert this plant tissue that you're digesting into the animal tissue that makes up your body? One way is you just eat a lot of it. So herbivores tend to eat a lot of plant material, and that's because they're trying to convert that plant tissue into animal tissue. I included this example because we've been seeing a lot of spittle bugs out in the field, those little bubbles that are all over the goldenrod out at Winnie Palmer. Spittle bugs are actually pretty unusual in terms of sap-feeding insects because they actually feed on the xylem, not the phloem. The phloem is like the good nutritious stuff that's in plants, but spittle bugs feed on the xylem, which is much more dilute than the phloem, which means they need to be drinking constantly and drinking a lot of it to get adequate nutrition. And that's basically why they have these little bubbles all over them, is that they're constantly pooping out this xylem solution because they have to constantly be excreting the waste because they're constantly drinking it to try to get enough nutrition from it. On Schoology, I included a link to a really cool New York Times video by my friend Jim Gorman at the New York Times about these really cool spittle bugs and how the spittle protects them. There's some other herbivory strategies too. You can have grazers that mostly feed on leafy materials. You can have browsers that feed on woody materials. Granivores feed on seeds. Frugivores eat fruit. You can have phloem sap feeders. Phloem has a lot more has a higher carbohydrate content, so it's a little more nutritious for phloem sap feeders. And then my favorite, you can have nectivores that feed on plant nectar. Now, grazers and browsers, because what they're eating is really high in cellulose and lignin, which are complex molecules that are really difficult to break down, they often use symbiotic bacteria and other protists in their gut to help digest the cellulose and proteins. And so they rely on a symbiosis between bacteria and protists in their gut. Otherwise, they would not be able to release the nutrition within the really fibrous material that they eat. A lot of herbivores tend to have a life history that matches the life history of their host plant. I've included some little cuties here that I really like that some of you have collected in lab. This is a tree hopper, a membracid. Membracids tend to produce offspring and lay their young during the spring and the summer when the plants are actively photosynthesizing, and so in that way they match their plant hosts' life history. And some of them even mimic thorns to blend in with the plants that they're feeding on. So a lot of herbivores are going to prefer nitrogen-rich plants when they're available. So usually if you're in a temperate region like Pennsylvania, most of the herbivores are going to be feeding right now when the plants are actively photosynthesizing, if they're even alive. So the amount of nitrogen availability, which is going to be linked to the photosynthetic capabilities of the plant, is going to increase the animal's growth and their reproductive success, and they're going to be able to assimilate the plant tissue into their own tissue more efficiently if that nitrogen is higher in the plant. And so usually, at least insect herbivores will go dormant when the plant source that they are feeding on is either not photosynthesizing at maximum capacity or is just dead. So that's herbivory. Now let's talk about carnivory. Carnivores feed on herbivores, and the main problem that they have is finding enough food. So the food they are eating is also animal tissue, and so it's really easy for the most part, to digest and to assimilate into the tissues of their own structures because it's also animals. Their main problem, though, is finding enough food, and so carnivores tend to be highly mobile because they need to be able to follow their prey items. I've included some more traditional predators here, but also one that also kind of freaks me out because I always think it's really creepy when an invertebrate eats a vertebrate. But that's a carnivore. Animal assimilating animal tissue. Now, omnivores will eat other animals and plants, and so they are incorporating plant-based tissues as well as animal-based tissues. So they have a diet that is spans a lot of different types of digestibility, and their food habits tend to vary with the seasons, as well as like the stage of the life cycle that they're in and their size and their growth rate. So things like cute little bears and foxes, for the most part, tend to eat berries, nuts, and insects during the summer, and then they eat mostly a carnivorous diet in the winter because plants and nuts and berries. Nuts actually can be around in the winter, but mostly berries and insects and other things like that are not around in the winter, and so they rely mostly on a meat-based diet during the winter. Right before winter, bears will eat as much as they possibly can find. If you've ever followed the National Park Service on Instagram, they have a contest of fattest bear every year, and it's so great to see all these really chunky mama bears at the end of the season, right before winter. The reason that they feed so much and they accumulate all of this weight and fat is so that they can gestate and give birth during hibernation. So typically these really, really chunky bears that you see right before winter, they are pregnant, and so they are trying to build up their fat reserves in their tissue reserves so that they can give birth during hibernation and consist on very limited food during that time period. Now let's talk about how animals respond to abiotic factors in the environment. Animals can be either conformers or regulators. I've also got partial regulators. We're not going to really talk about them here. Conformers are animals that are unable to maintain consistent internal conditions. I'll read that definition again. Conformers are unable to maintain consistent internal conditions. On the other hand, regulators are capable of regulating their own internal environment. And so their internal physiology and chemistry does not match the external environment. Conformers, they cannot maintain consistent internal conditions, physiology, chemistry, and so for the most part they are conforming to whatever happens to be going on in their external environment. So the reason I showed you my snurchins, which is what Maggie calls them, sea urchins, is that they are conformers. Their biochemistry and physiology need to be able to cope with environmental conditions. What that normally means is that they have a limited range of environments that they can live in, and so they are very restricted. They don't waste a lot of energy because they're not putting a lot of energy into maintaining a very delicate range of physiological parameters. They don't have to do that. They're just mostly matching their environment. And so they don't waste a lot of energy doing that. But they also usually grow and move slowly. My little sea urchins do not move around the tank very often. Probably because they are juvenile sea urchins and they're growing. And so they need to invest, and I feed them. I give them little pieces of like the seaweed you wrap in sushi. And so they don't need to move around to find food a lot. But they can't really move around to find food a lot because they are constrained by the biochemistry of their external environment. If you've ever tried to keep sea urchins, they can sometimes be really sensitive to pH and to tank chemistry because they are conformers. And like I said, I'll reiterate this point that usually conformers have a really limited range of environmental conditions in which they can live in. We'll talk about the concept of a niche later on, but usually the niche for a conformer is very restricted because they can't change their physiology to match their environment. Now, regulators, on the other hand, it can be very energetically costly to have a set of physiological parameters outside of what you're living in. It's very energetically costly and metabolically costly to maintain those internal conditions, but usually they're highly mobile and they can move to conditions that are more suitable for them. So they use their metabolism, their physiology, and their morphology, the shape of their bodies, just being able to, and then also their behavior. So behavior is just moving around in the environment. They use those to regulate their internal environment. So regulators tend to be mobile, highly mobile. They have to make changes in their behavior or their physiology or other parameters to maintain a very delicate stasis, homeostasis, internally. So it's a lot of energy, which means they have to eat a lot more than conformers. Conformers, because they grow slowly and they don't move a lot, they don't need to consume a lot. Regulators need to consume a lot to make up for that energy they're expending to maintain homeostasis. And for the most part, behavior is a first line of defense. They can walk around and bring their little babies with them as they move to more suitable more suitable places within their environment. Now let's talk a little bit about that homeostasis and feedback that I mentioned. Homeostasis is the maintenance of a relatively constant internal environment in a varying external environment. So this would be a phenomenon that happens in regulators. And regulators need a set of physiological cues to let their body know that they are that they might possibly be altering that homeostatic state, and so they need to be able to adjust. One really great negative feedback loop for maintaining homeostasis in mammals in particular is this negative feedback loop for internal body temperature. So you have this set point, which is the normal or desired state. Usually this isn't a single point, like a single temperature or a single amount of oxygen or whatever. It's usually a range at which homeostasis is maintained. And there's some sort of receptor that is monitoring that. So for temperature, in most mammals, it's the skin. The skin is the receptor for determining whether or not their body the external environment matches what they need to maintain homeostasis. So the receptor is the skin. The integrator, in this case, would be the brain, is going to evaluate that information from the receptor to determine whether or not there needs to be action taken to maintain homeostasis. And then the effectors are going to change in response to what the information being received by the receptor to modify their internal environment. So let's say it's way too hot. Your skin senses that you are gaining heat from the environment. You need to maintain a pretty consistent body temperature. Your brain then tells your skin to sweat or to vasodilate, your pores open, and that allows heat to be lost from your body. I'm always constantly sweating all the time when we are out at Winnie Park because it's been hot out recently. On the opposite end of the spectrum, if it's colder outside than the homeostatic optimum set point for your body, your skin will sense that, integrate it into the brain. The brain will then tell the skin to give you goosebumps, close up your pores, and vasoconstrict so that you can keep in as much heat as possible to maintain that homeostasis. So that's temperature. Oxygen is also really, really important for animals. They obtain their energy from their food, and then anaerobic respiration is part of that, and that requires oxygen. So animals need oxygen. Many animals are oxygen regulators, and so they have a certain level of oxygen within which they can operate. If we do a extra credit screening of Spaceship Earth, you'll learn about what happened when the oxygen just got slightly too low within the biosphere experiment and everyone started slowing down and barely being able to move because they were outside, because humans are oxygen regulators and they need a certain amount of oxygen to operate properly. Oxygen can be very limiting in aquatic environments, depending on the amount of dissolved oxygen that's in the water. We already talked about like velocity and other ways that oxygen gets into aquatic environments. So depending on the abiotic factors going on in the environment, the oxygen may be low or high. But for some animals, they're small enough that they can obtain oxygen just through straight diffusion. So these mimarids, these fairy wasps that I told you about that are so small they basically swim through water like it's air, like the laws of physics change for them. They, for the most part, just obtain oxygen straight through diffusion through their cuticle. Some larger insects, like crickets, have a more complicated tracheal system, so they have these tiny little holes to the outside world. They're called spiracles. Those spiracles connect to a tracheal system that goes through the body and provides diffusion of oxygen straight into the tissues. So this is for larger ones that obviously can't have most of their surface area exposed to the oxygen. This is a way of increasing surface area like we talked about earlier. Lungs are another great way. The larger you are, the less surface area you have exposed. And so to be able to get oxygen to all your tissues, you need to increase that surface area, and lungs are a great way of doing that. Most oxygen conformers, they are very rare, but most of them, for the most part, are sedentary. Sea urchins and cnidarians are oxygen conformers. And depending on dissolved oxygen present in the water, they will speed up or slow down their metabolism in response to that. In my aquarium, I have a flow filter that hopefully provides enough dissolved oxygen for my little buddies in there. Let's talk about aquatic oxygen regulators because oxygen is limited and animals need special structures to obtain oxygen from aquatic environments. Smaller things like I mentioned, like zooplankton, like these copepods. I think I actually have this species living in my tank. They just take up oxygen via diffusion right across the surface of their cuticle. Larger aquatic animals will have gills, like a clam. Here are their gill plates, so that allows them to obtain oxygen from the water, so they pass the water over and they collect the oxygen that's present in it. Starfish, you probably learned about this in Gen Bio 1. They've got a more complicated series of projections that allow them to obtain oxygen from the environment. So that's another way of increasing surface area and exposure so that they can obtain oxygen from the water. And then most aquatic vertebrates pump oxygen through their mouth over a set of gills, so like fish. That's how fish obtain oxygen from the water. So the water passes through and then they obtain the oxygen from the water as it passes through their gills. And so they're for the most part, they're constantly, well, it actually depends on the oxygen content of the water. They're passing water over their gills so that they can breathe. Water is also important for metabolic processes in animals. So particularly in terrestrial environments, animals need to make sure they can obtain and also release water. So it is possible to have too much water, and so animals need a way of expelling that water when they have too much. It's also possible to have too little. So there are three main ways of gaining water and solutes that are dissolved in water. You can drink it like this little kitty cat. You can, this GIF is actually from a paper that came out in Science a few years ago about the physics of cats drinking water. They actually make a column of water with their tongue and then they bite over it, which is really weird. Anyway, you can drink water. You can get it through the food that you eat. A lot of carnivores get most of their water from the blood and the water content of the prey items that they eat, so you can get it through eating. And then you can also produce water through metabolism and respiration. You also need to be able to lose water when you have too much and solutes that are dissolved in water. You can pee it out, you can poop it out, you can evaporate it through your skin, through sweating. So you can sweat to change your body temperature, but also as a way of losing water. And then you can also, animals in general, can exhale moist air to lose water. Now, loss of water and uptake of water are really important for animals that live in arid environments, and there are specific ways that animals can deal with that in areas where water is very limited. One way is through migration. These are some water buffalo around a watering hole. These herds will move based on, sometimes these water holes can be ephemeral, which means they'll dry up, and sometimes the entire herd will have to move. This herd migration can protect them from predators and also increase their probability of finding a water source. So migration is a great way, just move to where the water is. They can also estivate, which is a period of physiological inactivity. So they're still physiologically active. This is generally what animals do during hibernation. So they're still metabolizing. They might even still move around a lot, but they're not doing it a ton, and so that limits
the amount of water that they need when water is limited in the environment. There's also diapause. This is something that bumblebees do. This is one of my favorite bumblebee species. This is Bombus dalbomii. It lives in Patagonia, in Chile, and Argentina. It's currently endangered, but it lives in arid environments in South America. And bumblebees and other insects during periods of water limitation will enter a stage of diapause. So this is physiologically different from estivation. It's a very, very slowed down rate of metabolism, so slow that they don't need to eat or drink at all during this period, is what diapause is. So bumblebees will do that during the winter. A lot of insects enter a diapause period during the winter. Another way to deal with an arid environment is to reduce the amount of water lost through respiration through different breathing mechanisms. So this little guy here is a jerboa, or a kangaroo rat, and they have these like very intricate nasal passages that have lots of projections and canals that allow them to condense moisture as they breathe. So the water they lose through respiration, they then can gain back by it condensing in their nasal passages as they breathe, so that they don't lose any water that they're respiring. You can also deal with water loss through different osmotic states, through hyperosmosis, hypoosmosis, and isoosmosis. So hyperosmosis is when you have a higher salt concentration internally than externally. Freshwater fish, they live in environments that are lower in solutes, at least compared to saltwater environments, and so they need to retain solutes that they gain through the water, and so they have they can retain solutes and salt in these special cells in their gills, and they make very watery urine because the environment they live in is very low in solutes, and so they're constantly passing the water so that they can obtain more solutes from the water. Amphibians can absorb ions directly across their skin and store water in their bladder for reabsorption whenever they're on the land. Hypoosmotic is when you have a lower salt concentration internally than externally. This is something that mostly marine animals have to deal with. There's a lot of solutes dissolved in marine water. That's what makes it salty. And those animals are constantly dealing with lower salt concentrations inside their bodies than externally. So what they do is they drink a lot of water to make up for that deficit. They're constantly flushing out those solutes through their gills or through their urine. And so in contrast to freshwater fish, saltwater fish make lots of concentrated urine, which makes their tanks really hard to take care of because they're peeing constantly, and so you have to do water changes all the time with marine fish, and they can excrete ions through their gills. And then isoosmotic is when you have the same osmotic pressure internally as externally. These animals that tend to match the osmotic pressure of their external environment tend to be marine invertebrates, which I like taking care of because they don't produce nearly as much waste as marine fish. So that'd be things like starfish and jellyfish, but not all marine invertebrates. A really awesome predator that I would like you to watch a video about that I've uploaded from Nat Geo onto Schoology is the werewolf mouse. This is a picture of it howling at the moon. You have to watch this video. They have really amazing adaptations for dealing with water loss in their environments, and then also dealing with predation and other things in their environment. So make sure to watch the Nat Geo video that I posted to Schoology on werewolf mice. Now let's talk about energy exchange and energy loss in the environment. Animals are going to produce heat through metabolism, and being mobile is how they move to more suitable environments. Some animals will retain heat through feather or scales and hair, and that creates a boundary layer just above the body within the hair and the feather and the scales. And so the external environment you don't actually measure until you're outside of the feathers and the scales and the hair, because the feathers and the hairs create like an insulating layer around the organism, and that lets them retain body heat. We also have to think about the thermal conductivity. Animals have differences in thermal conductivity based on the environments that they have evolved in. So they'll have different abilities to conduct or transmit heat. This is an illustration of an animal with a blubber layer. So animals with blubber, a thick blubber layer, are going to be more thermally conductive and be able to retain more heat than other animals. Terrestrial animals in particular have to deal with much more drastic changes in temperature than aquatic organisms, like we talked about a few lectures ago. Water has a really high specific heat. It takes a lot of energy to heat it up and to cool it down, which means that the temperature change isn't as drastic in aquatic environments. Air, on the other hand, can change temperatures drastically. All you have to do is like go outside in Pennsylvania to experience that. So terrestrial animals need to be able to deal with that. So let's talk about thermoregulation in animals. Poikilotherms are animals with variable body temperature. These are not conformers. They just can live at variable different body temperatures in the environment, and they don't regulate a very narrow range at which their body needs to operate to maintain metabolism. Homeotherms, on the other hand, are animals that have a constant or nearly constant body temperature. So we would be homeotherms. This little dude would be a homeotherm. These would be poikilotherms. This is actually a species that I have as a pet. My pet lizard Pepper. If we weren't in a pandemic, I'd bring her in and show her to you, but I don't think she wants to hang out in my car all day. She's very cute. That's the male, that's the female. So lizards would be an example of poikilotherms. So thermoregulation and homeotherms, they need to be able to, sometimes they can do this with behavior. So this little dude is sunning themselves to maintain that internal body temperature through physiological and morphology. So sometimes they'll have structures on their body that help them maintain their body temperature. So that's poikilotherms and homeotherms. Another note that I want to make is that there really aren't any thermoconformers that really exist except for animals that live in environments that have little to no variation in the ambient temperature. There are very few environments that are like that. Most of them are probably just like animals that live in the deep ocean. Animals that live in the deep ocean are probably the closest you get to being thermoconformers. Anyway, so that's poikilotherms and homeotherms, and there's ectotherms and endotherms. Ectotherms maintain body temperature through the exchange of thermal energy with the surrounding environment. So these guys are ectotherms. Actually, sorry, I think I said they're poikilotherms, but they're actually ectotherms too. Then you have endothermy, which is maintaining body temperature through internally generated metabolic heat. So these are animals that can warm themselves up. These are animals that can't really warm themselves up, so they have to use behavioral mechanisms to warm themselves up, like sunning themselves on rocks like lizards do. All animals are going to use thermal energy to modify their body temperature, but only birds and mammals are endothermic homeotherms. So let's talk about some poikilotherms. These are animals that can live at variable body temperatures. Under stress, such as high physical activity, they can't supply enough oxygen to their tissues, so they'll use anaerobic respiration. But what this anaerobic respiration does is it depletes the stored energy and accumulates lactic acid, and so that results in short bouts of activity. So things that are poikilotherms are limited to really short bouts of activity, and mostly they rely on behavioral thermoregulation to move around. So they'll sun themselves or move to to shade to cool themselves down. This is a frog that can survive freezing and thawing. And I'll talk about it again in a little bit. This is actually it thawing out. So this is a frog that's been frozen and then taken out of the freezer, and it can survive it. This is a carpenter bee that is regulating its body temperature by pumping its little butt to cool itself down, or to warm itself up, probably to cool itself down. So that's Poikilotherms. Let's talk about Homeotherms. Homeotherms maintain a very narrow range of body temperature through metabolizing glucose, through respiration. When we're talking about homeotherms, they have a thermoneutral zone, which is the range of environmental temperatures within which their metabolic rates are minimal. So that would be here the zone of thermoneutrality on this graph. They can use insulation to regulate exchange of heat, so sometimes that can be blubber, sometimes that can be fur, feathers. Smaller mammals, although they can regulate their body temperature somewhat, and they do have to maintain a narrow range, they're less capable of supporting an insulating layer because they're smaller, and so they have to use a lot of behavioral modifications to make sure that they don't go outside of their zone of thermoneutrality. And they can also use acclimation. So animals that, next slide. Animals can shed their fur. This is a fox, a winter fox that has its winter coat, so its tail's all poofy. It's all poofy because it's got this thicker layer of fur to help regulate its body temperature in the winter. This is a husky that somebody is brushing, that's shedding for the summer. Some birds with some insulating layers. They also have some behavioral modifications. Homeotherms can have some behavioral modifications to help cool themselves down as well. Light-colored furs can reflect solar radiation to help in cooling down an animal. When they don't have thick enough insulation to regulate their body temperature, sometimes they can shiver or burn up some of their brown adipose tissue to maintain their body heat. When it's too hot, on the other hand, sometimes they can do evaporative cooling through sweating or panting. If a dog is panting, but dogs don't sweat, but they can pant to cool themselves down. These are some piggies that are cooling off by rolling around in some mud to cool themselves down. So let's do a little comparison in contrast of endothermy versus ectothermy. So this is some ectothermic animals that are small and large, Komodo dragon, tiny chameleon, and then some endotherms. This is the tiny pygmy shrew and the elephant. So endotherms can remain active regardless of their environment, but the problem with needing to have lots of behavioral modifications to match your environment is that it's very energetically costly. So being an endotherm is very energetically costly, and so they need to be eating a lot to make up for that energy cost. So the metabolic cost of being endotherm is high, but ectotherms, on the other hand, can allocate more energy to the production of biomass, so sometimes they can get real big because they can enter these metabolically slow states when food is limited or when the temperature isn't optimal. So ectotherms require less food. They can survive well in times of water and food storage because they can slow their metabolic rates, and in temperature extremes because they can adjust to the outside temperatures. You find a lot of ectotherms like desert lizards and things like that in depauperate habitats because they can deal with periods of resource inavailability. Ectotherms can't generally be very large because of the surface area to volume ratio. So larger ectotherms like the Komodo dragon tend to live in warmer climates because if they have periods of cold, they're not really going to be able to regulate their body temperature. So the ectotherms can have variable body temperatures, but within certain limits. So, they can, besides maybe that frog that can freeze, some of them do have limits. And so if it gets cold, they are much less incapable of stopping their bodies from losing body heat. And so generally you only find the big ones in warmer climates. Endotherms lose heat the larger that their surface area to volume ratio is. So sometimes, so like this little guy, much less incapable of regulating its body temperature than an elephant because they have a higher surface area to volume ratio. So smaller is not always better with endotherms. Smaller endotherms also end up having really high metabolic activities because they need to do a lot of extra work to make sure their body temperature remains constant. A lot of birds and mammals, because of the metabolic demands of being endothermic, are born altricial, which means basically they are born not being able to take care of themselves. The opposite of altricial, which we'll talk about later on in this semester, is precocial, which means like right as soon as they pop out of their mother's womb, they can walk in, they can run off. Altricial would mean they are still in stages of development when they're born out of the placenta. So here's some examples here. It is very energetically costly for a mother to be raising this many animals inside of her womb, and so birthing those animals quote unquote early in development reduces the metabolic demands on the mother so that she can then allocate all of the food she's eating to herself and then go and find food for her young or produce food through milk. Now let's talk about heterotherms, which are some of my favorite. A lot of pollinators tend to be heterotherms. Heterotherms are animals that can switch back and forth between homeothermy and poikilothermy. And a lot of homeotherms can enter a state called torpor. So these are periods of inactivity during the day to save energy costs. Something that bees do actually is that they like to bumblebees in particular, kind of take a siesta at the hottest part of the day. So when I've been out doing field work all over the world, there are periods of inactivity during the day when bumblebees are not out because it's just too hot for them. So bumblebees can, and carpenter bees actually doing it here, can pump their blood at certain times to generate heat throughout their body. So they can, at their very little bit, regulate their body temperature. But for the most part, they're also insects, so they are also poikilotherms, and so they enter states of diapause during the winter when there isn't food available to them. Oh, and then this is a butterfly. Sometimes they can do these like tremoring behaviors, so they'll warm themselves in the sun, but also they can do these tremoring behaviors that help them warm up their body temperature so that they can take flight. You mostly see this happening in the fall when it gets too cold in the mornings for them to fly, and so they just kind of get stuck where they are, and then they do this tremoring to warm themselves up. This is this really cool frog that can produce glycerol in its blood to keep it from freezing all the way in the winter. I'll talk about that in a second. We already talked about torpor. Hibernation is another thing that heterotherms can do to deal with long seasonal periods of inactivity and resource limitation. So this is a bumblebee queen that is thawing out from being in hibernation during the winter. So then she'll come out of her hibernation and start a nest in the spring. So this is a complete cessation of activity and controlled hypothermia. So both of these are doing that. Like I said before, bumblebees and honeybees are capable of making their own heat, but they are insects, so they can't regulate their body like a true endotherm. But what they can do is they can vibrate their muscles, and that vibration creates heat in their body. And so you can get a bumblebee flying when there's still snow on the ground because they're capable of vibrating their muscles and generating heat. So they generate heat in the thorax. They then pump their butt back and forth, and that pumps the warm blood from their thorax into their abdomen, so that it warms up their body. Honeybees do not, well, they enter a sort of torpor in the winter, but they don't really hibernate like bumblebees do. The bees just go into the nest and they create these things that are called winter clusters. And the bees generate a temperature of a, now I'm probably going to get this temperature wrong. Hopefully none of my bee researcher friends watch this. I think it's about 95 degrees is the temperature they maintain in the colony. Now, they are not endotherms, but they do this process where they vibrate their wing muscles. They detach them from their wings and they vibrate them to generate heat. And then they pump their blood and it warms them up. So they'll warm themselves up in the middle. And then as that bee gets tired, it then moves to the outside of the cluster and takes a break, and then more bees move in and they generate that heat. And this is what bees are doing in their colony all winter long, to protect the queen and to maintain the colony. So bees are heterotherms because they can be slightly endothermic, but also only to an extent. Some animals have really cool, unique physiological adaptations to temperature. So some animals are capable of supercooling, which is their body falls below a freezing point without actually freezing. So this frog has glycerol in its blood that protects its cells from freezing damage. A lot of animals that are capable, so like Arctic fish, Arctic insects, they'll have glycerol in their body or antifreeze proteins that help protect them during freezing periods. So ice crystals can actually physically shear cells, and so that glycerol protects the cells in their body from freezing damage. Some animals can store body heat. This chonky groundhog is a unique physiological adaptation to winter temperatures. And of course, the physiological, so the adaptations that animals have in the environment are dictated by the environment that they evolve in, but then the environment that they can then live in is going to be restricted by those physiological adaptations. So it's a constant cycle. We'll talk a little bit more about habitat later on. But habitat is the place where an organism is found, and animals are capable of selecting the habitats that they live on. In animals and plants, they can grow or not grow in that habitat depending on whether or not it's optimal for them based on their physiological adaptations. So later on in the semester, we'll talk a little bit about why you find some species in one habitat but not the other, and how are organisms able to assess the suitability of an area? So how does an organism assess whether or not a habitat is preferable or not preferable? What do they look for? Sometimes they are physically looking for it. Plants obviously don't have eyeballs, but what do they seek when they're looking for a place to live? We'll talk about all that stuff later on in the semester. So that's a long lecture video, but it's the last one before exam 1. And that's it. Okay. Bye-bye.